Chapter 11. A Knife in the Dark. As they prepared for sleep in the inn at Bree, darkness lay on Buckland, a mist strayed in the dells and along the river bank. The house at Cricket Hollow stood silent. Fatty Bulger opened the door cautiously and peered out. A feeling of fear had been growing on him all day, and he was unable to rest or go to bed. There was a brooding threat in the breathless night air. As he stared out into the gloom, a black shadow moved under the trees. The gate seemed to open of its own accord and close again without a sound. Terror seized him. He shrank back, and for a moment he stood trembling in the hall. Then he shut and locked the door. The night deepened. There came the soft sound of horses led with stealth along the lane. Outside the gate they stopped, and three black figures entered, like shades of night creeping across the ground. One went to the door, one to the corner of the house on either side, and there they stood, as still as the shadows of stones, while night went slowly on. The house and the quiet trees seemed to be waiting breathlessly. There was a faint stir in the leaves, and a cock crowed far away. The cold hour before dawn was passing. The figure by the door moved. In the dark, without moon or stars, a drawn blade gleamed, as if a chill light had been unsheathed. There was a blow, soft but heavy, and the door shuddered. "Open in the name of Mordor," said a voice thin and menacing. At the second blow, the door yielded and fell back. With timbers burst and lock broken, the black figures passed swiftly in. At that moment, among the trees nearby, a horn rang out. It rent the night like fire on a hilltop. "Awake! Fear! Fire! Foes! Awake!" Fatty Bulger had not been idle. As soon as he saw the dark shapes creep from the garden, he knew that he must run for it or perish. And run he did, out of the back door, through the garden, and over the fields. When he reached the nearest house, more than a mile away, he collapsed on the doorstep. "No, no, no," he was crying. "No, not me. I haven't got it." It was some time before anyone could make out what his babbling was about. At last they got the idea that enemies were in Buckland, some strange invasion from the old forest. And then they lost no more time. "Fire! Fear! Foes!" The brandybucks were blowing the horn called of Buckland. That had not been sounded for hundreds of years. Not since the white wolves came in the fell winter, when the brandywine was frozen over. "Awake! Awake!" Far away answering horns were heard. The alarm was spreading. The black figures fled from the house. One of them let fall a hobbit cloak on the step as he ran. In the lane the noise of hoofs broke out, and gathering to a gallop, went hammering away into the darkness. All about Cricket Hollow there was the sound of horns blowing, and voices carrying, and feet running. But the black riders rode like a gale to the north gate. Let the little people blow. Sauron would deal with them later. Meanwhile, they had another errand. They knew now that the house was empty and the ring had gone. They rode down the guards at the gate and vanished from the Shire. In the early night, Frodo woke from deep sleep suddenly, as if some sound or presence had disturbed him. He saw that Strider was sitting alert in his chair. His eyes gleamed in the light of the fire, which had been tended and was burning brightly, but he made no sign or movement. Frodo soon went to sleep again, but his dreams were again troubled with the noise of wind and of galloping hoofs. The wind seemed to be curling round the house and shaking it, and far off he heard a horn blow wildly. He opened his eyes and heard a cock crowing lustily in the inn yard. Strider had drawn the curtains and pushed back the shutters with a clang. The first grey light of day was in the room, and a cold air was coming through the open window. As soon as Strider had roused them all, he led the way to their bedrooms. When they saw them, they were glad they had taken his advice. The windows had been forced open and were swinging, and the curtains were flapping. The beds were tossed out, and the bolsters slashed and flung upon the floor. The brown mat was torn to pieces. Strider immediately went to fetch the landlord. Poor Mr. Butterbur looked sleepy and frightened, but had hardly closed his eyes all night, so he said, but he had never heard a sound. "Never has such a thing happened in my time," he cried, raising his hands in horror. "Guests unable to sleep in their beds, and good bolsters ruined and all. What are we coming to?" "Dark times," said Strider. But for the present, you may be left in peace when we have got rid of us. When you have got rid of us. Fuck. We will leave at once. Never mind about breakfast. A drink and a bite standing will have to do. We shall be packed in a few minutes. Mr. Butterbur hurried off to see that their ponies were got ready and to fetch them a bite. But very soon he came back in dismay. The ponies had vanished. The stable doors had been opened all night, and they were gone. Not only Mary's ponies, but every other horse and beast in the place. Frodo was crushed by the news. How could they hope to reach Rivendell on foot, pursued by mounted enemies? They might as well set out for the moon. Strider sat silent for a while, looking at the hobbits, as if he was weighing up their strength and courage. Ponies would not help us to escape horsemen, he said at last, thoughtfully, as if he guessed what Frodo had in mind. We should not go much slower on foot, not on the roads that I mean to take. I was going to walk in any case. It is the food and stores that trouble me. We cannot count on getting anything to eat between here and Rivendell, except what we can take with us, and we ought to take plenty to spare, for we may be delayed, or forced to go roundabout, far out of the direct way. How much are you prepared to carry on your backs? As much as we must, said Pippin with a sinking heart, but trying to show that he was tougher than he looked or felt. I can carry enough for two, said Sam defiantly. Can't anything be done, Mr. Butterbur? Asked Frodo. Can't we get a couple of ponies in the village, or even one just for baggage? I don't suppose we could hire them, but we might be able to buy them, he added doubtfully, wondering if he could afford it. I doubt it, said the landlord unhappily. The 2 or 3 riding ponies that were in Bree were stabled in my yard, and they're gone. As for other animals, horses or ponies, for drought or whatnot, there are very few of them in Bree, and they won't be for sale. But I'll do what I can. I'll rout out Bob and send him round as soon as may be. Yes, Strider said reluctantly. You had better do that. I'm afraid we shall have to try to get one pony at least, but so ends all hope of starting early and slipping away quietly. We might as well have blown a horn to announce our departure. That was part of their plan, no doubt. There is one crumb of comfort, said Mary, and more than a crumb, I hope. We can have breakfast while we wait, and sit down to it. Let's get hold of Nob. In the end, there was no more than 3 hours' delay. Bob came back with the report that no horse or pony was to be got for love or money in the neighborhood except one. Bill Fernie had one that he might possibly sell. A poor half-starved creature it is, said Bob, but he won't part with it for less than thrice its worth, seeing how you're placed. Not if I knows Bill Fernie. Bill Fernie, said Frodo. Isn't there some trick? Wouldn't the beast bolt back to him with all our stuff, or help in tracking us, or something? I wonder, said Strider, but I cannot imagine any animal running home to him once it got away. I fancy this is only an afterthought of kind Master Fernie's, just a way of increasing his profits from the affair. The chief danger is that the poor beast is probably at death's door, but there does not seem any choice. What does he want for it? Bill Fernie's price was 12 silver pennies, and that was indeed at least 3 times the pony's value in those parts. It proved to be a bony, underfed, and dispirited animal, but it did not look like dying just yet. Mr. Butterbur paid for it himself, and offered Mary another 18 pence as some compensation for the lost animals. He was an honest man, and well off as things were reckoned in Bree, but 30 silver pennies was a sore blow to him, and being cheated by Bill Fernie made it harder to bear. As a matter of fact, he came out on the right side in the end. It turned out later that only one horse had actually been stolen. The others had been driven off, or had bolted in terror, and were found wandering in different corners of the Bree land. Mary's ponies had escaped altogether, and eventually, having a good deal of sense, they made their way to the downs in search of Fatty Lumpkin. So they came under the care of Tom Bombadil for a while, and were well off. But when news of the events at Bree came to Tom's ears, he sent them to Mr. Butterbur, who thus got 5 good beasts at a very fair price. They had to work harder in Bree, but Bob treated them well, so on the whole they were lucky. They missed a dark and dangerous journey, but they never came to Rivendell. However, in the meanwhile, for all Mr. Butterbur knew, his money was gone for good, or for bad, and he had other troubles, for there was a great commotion as soon as the remaining guests were astir and heard news of the rain on the inn. The southern travelers had lost several horses and blamed the innkeeper loudly until it became known that one of their own number had also disappeared in the night, none other than Bill Ferny's squint-eyed companion. Suspicion fell on him at once. "If you pick up with a horse thief and bring him to my house," said Butterbur angrily, "you ought to pay for all the damage yourselves and not come shouting at me. Go and ask Ferny where your handsome friend is." But it appeared that he was nobody's friend, and nobody could recollect when he had joined their party. After their breakfast, the hobbits had to repack and get together further supplies for the longer journey that they were now expecting. It was close on 10 o'clock before they at last got off. By that time, the whole Bree was buzzing with excitement. Frodo's vanishing trick, the appearance of the Black Horseman, the robbing of the stables, and not least the news that Strider the Ranger had joined the mysterious hobbits, made such a tale as would last for many uneventful years. Most of the inhabitants of Bree and Stattle, and many even from Combe and Archet, were crowded in the road to see the travelers start. The other guests in the inn were at the doors or hanging out of the windows. Strider had changed his mind, and he decided to leave Bree by the main road. Any attempt to set off across country at once would only make matters worse. Half the inhabitants would follow them to see what they were up to and to prevent them from trespassing. They said farewell to Nob and Bob and took leave of Mr. Butterbur with many thanks. "I hope we shall meet again some day, when things are merry once more," said Frodo. "I should like nothing better than to stay in your house in peace for a while." They trampled off, anxious and downhearted, under the eyes of the crowd. Not all of the faces were friendly, nor all the words that were shouted, but Strider seemed to be held in awe by most of the Breelanders, and those that he stared at shut their mouths and drew away. He walked in front with Frodo. Next came Merry and Pippin, and at last came Sam, leading the pony, which was laden with as much of their baggage as they had the heart to give it. But already it looked less dejected, as if it approved of the change in its fortunes. Sam was chewing an apple thoughtfully. He had a pocket full of them, a parting present from Nob and Bob. "Apples for walking and a pipe for sitting," he said, "but I reckon I'll miss them both for long." The hobbits took no notice of the inquisitive heads that peeped out of the doors or popped over walls and fences as they passed. But as they drew near to the further gate, Frodo saw a dark, ill-kept house behind a thick hedge, the last house in the village. In one of the windows he caught a glimpse of a shallow face with shy, slanting eyes, but it vanished at once. "So that's where that southerner is hiding," he thought. "He looks more than half like a goblin." Over the hedge another man was staring boldly. He had heavy black brows, the dark, scornful eyes. His large mouth curled in a sneer. He was smoking a short black pipe. As they approached, he took it out of his mouth and spat. "Morning, Longshanks," he said. "Off early? Found some friends at last." Strider nodded, but did not answer. "Morning, my little friends," he said to the others. "I suppose you know who you've taken up with. That stick-out-knot Strider, that is. Though I've heard other names not so pretty. Watch out tonight. And you, Sammy, don't go ill-treating my poor old pony. Pah!" He spat again. Sam turned around quickly. "And you, Ferny," he said, "put your ugly face out of sight, or it will get hurt." With a sudden flick, quick as lightning, an apple left his hand and hit Bill square in the nose. He ducked too late, and curses came from behind the hedge. "Waste of a good apple," said Sam regretfully, and strode on. At last they left the village behind. The escorted children and stragglers that had followed them got tired and turned back to the south gate. Passing through, they kept on along the road for some miles. It bent to the left, curving back into its eastward line as it rounded the feet of Bree Hill, and then they began to run swiftly downwards into wooded country. To their left they could see some of the houses and hobbit holes of Stattle on the gentler southeastern slopes of the hill. Down in a deep hollow, away north of the road, There were wisps of rising smoke that showed where Combe lay. Archette was hidden in the trees beyond. After the road had run down some way, and had left Bree Hill standing tall and brown behind, they came on a narrow track that led off towards the north. "This is where we leave the open and take cover," said Strider. "Not a shortcut, I hope," said Pippin. "Our last shortcut through the woods nearly ended in disaster." "Ah, but you had not got me with you then," laughed Strider. "My cuts, short or long, do not go wrong." He took a look up and down the road. No one was in sight, and he led the way quickly down towards the wooded valley. His plan, as far as they could understand it, without knowing the country, was to go towards Archette at first, but to bear right and pass it to the east, and then to steer as straight as he could over the wildlands to Weathertop Hill. In that way they would, if all went well, cut off a great loop of the road, which further on bent southwards to avoid the Midgewater marshes, but, of course, they would have to pass through the marshes themselves, since Strider's description of them was not encouraging. However, in the meanwhile, walking was not unpleasant. Indeed, if it had not been for the disturbing events of the night before, they would have enjoyed this part of the journey better than any up to that time. The sun was shining, clear but not too hot. The woods in the valley were still leafy and full of color, and seemed peaceful and wholesome. Strider guided them confidently among the many crossing paths, although left to themselves they would soon have been at a loss. He was taking a wandering course, with many turns and doublings, to put off any pursuit. "Bill Fernie would have watched where we left the road for certain," he said, "though I do not think he will follow us himself. He knows the land round here well enough, but he knows he is not a match for me in a wood. It is what he may tell others that I am afraid of. I don't suppose they are far away. If they think we have made for Archette, so much the better." Whether because of Strider's skill or for some reason, they saw no sign and heard no sound of any other living thing all day, neither two-footed, except birds, nor four-footed, except one fox and a few squirrels. The next day they began to steer a steady course eastwards, and still all was quiet and peaceful. On the third day from Bree, they came out of the Chetwood. The land had been falling steadily ever since they turned aside from the road, and they now entered a wide, flat expanse of country, much more difficult to manage. They were far beyond the borders of the Bree land, out in the pathless wilderness, and drawing near to the Midgewater marshes. The ground now became damp, and in places boggy, and here and there they came upon pools, and wide stretches of reeds and rushes filled with the warbling of little hidden birds. They had to pick their way carefully to keep both dry-footed and on their proper course. At first they made fair progress, but as they went on, their passage became slower and more dangerous. The marshes were bewildering and treacherous, and there was no permanent trail even for rangers to find through their shifting quagmires. The flies began to torment them, and the air was full of clouds of tiny midges that crept up their sleeves and breeches and into their hair. "I'm being eaten alive," cried Pippin. "Midgewater! There are more midges than water." "What do they live on when they can't get hobbits?" asked Sam, scratching his neck. "They spend a miserable day in this lonely and unpleasant country." Their camping place was damp, cold, and uncomfortable, and the biting insects would not let them sleep. There were also abominable creatures haunting the reeds and tussocks that from the south of them were evil relatives of the cricket. There were thousands of them, and they squeaked all round. Neek, breek, breek, neek, unceasingly all the night, until the hobbits were nearly frantic. The next day, the 4th, was little better, and the night almost as comfortless. Though the Knickerbreakers, as Sam called them, had been left behind, the midges still pursued them. As Frodo lay, tired but unable to close his eyes, it seemed to him that far away there came a light in the eastern sky. It flashed and faded many times. It was not the dawn, for that was still some hours off. "What is that light? Oh, what is that light?" he said to Strider, who had risen and was standing gazing ahead into the night. "I don't know," Strider answered. "It is too distant to make out. It is like lightning that leaps up from the hilltops." Frodo lay down again, but for a long while he could still see the white flashes, and against them the dark, tall figure of Strider, standing silent and watchful. At last he passed into uneasy sleep. They had not gone far on the 5th day when they left the last straggling pools of reed beds of marshes behind them. The land before them began steadily to rise again. Away in the distance eastward they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the line, and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. "That is Weathertop," said Strider. "The old road which we have left far away on our right runs to the south of it, and passes not far from its foot. We might reach it by noon tomorrow, if we go straight towards it. I suppose we had better do so." "What do you mean?" asked Frodo. "I mean, when we do get there, it is not certain what we shall find. It is close to the road." "But surely we were hoping to find Gandalf there." "Yes, but the hope is faint. If he comes this way at all, he may not pass through Bree, and so he may not know what we are doing. And anyway, unless by luck we arrive almost together, we shall miss one another. It will not be safe for him or for us to wait there long. If the riders fail to find us in the wilderness, they are likely to make for Weathertop themselves. It commands a wide view all around. Indeed, there are many birds and beasts in this country that could see us, as we stand here from that hilltop. Not all the birds are to be trusted, and there are other spies more evil than they are." The hobbits looked anxiously at the distant hills. Sam looked up into the pale sky, fearing to see hawks or eagles hovering over them with bright, unfriendly eyes. "You do make me feel uncomfortable and lonesome, Strider," he said. "What do you advise us to do?" asked Frodo. "I think," answered Strider slowly, as if he was not quite sure, "I think the best thing is to go as straight eastward from here as we can, to make for the line of hills, not for Weathertop. There we can strike a path I know that runs at their feet. It will bring us to Weathertop from the north and less openly. Then we shall see what we shall see." All that day they plodded along until a cold and early evening came down. The land became drier and more barren, but mists and vapors lay beyond them on the marshes. A few melancholy birds were piping and wailing, until the round red sun sank slowly into the western shadows. Then an empty silence fell. The hobbits thought of the soft light of sunset glancing through the cheerful windows of Bag End far away. At the day's end, they came to a stream that wandered down from the hills to lose itself in the stagnant marshland, and then went up along its banks while the light lasted. It was already night when at last they halted and made their camp under some stunted alder trees by the shores of the stream. Ahead there loomed now against the dark dusk sky the bleak and treeless backs of the hills. That night they set a watch, and Strider, it seemed, did not sleep at all. The moon was waxing, and in the early night hours a cold gray light lay on the land. Next morning they set out again as soon after sunrise. There was a frost in the air, and the sky was a pale, clear blue. The hobbits felt refreshed as if they had had a night of unbroken sleep. Already they were getting used to much walking on short commons, shorter at any rate than what in the Shire would have thought barely enough to keep them on their legs. Pippin declared that Frodo was looking twice the hobbit he had been. "Very odd," said Frodo, tightening his belt. "Considering that there is actually a good deal less of me, I hope the thinning process will not go on indefinitely, or I shall become a wraith." "Do not speak of such things," said Strider quickly, and with surprising earnestness. The hills drew nearer. They made an undulating ridge, often rising almost to 1,000 feet, and here and there falling down to low clefts or passes leading into the eastern land beyond. Along the crest of the ridge the hobbits could see what looked to be the remains of green-grown walls and dikes, and in the clefts there still stood the ruins of old works of stone. By night they had reached the feet of the western slopes, and there they camped. It was the night of the 5th of October, and they were 6 days out from Bree. In the morning they found, for the first time since they had left the Chetwood, a track plain to see. They turned right and followed it southwards. It ran cunningly, taking a line that seemed chosen so as to keep as much hidden as possible from the view, both of the hilltops above and of the flats to the west. It dived into dells and hugged steep banks, and where it passed over flatter and more open ground on either side of it, there were lines of large boulders and hewn stones that screened the travelers almost like a hedge. "I wonder who made this path and what for," said Mary, as he walked along one of these avenues where the stones were unusually large and closely set. "I'm not sure that I like it. It has rather a barrow-weightish look. Is there any barrow in Weathertop?" "No, there is no barrow on Weathertop, nor any of these hills," answered Strider. "The men of the West do not live here, though in their later days they defended the hills for a while against the evil that came out of Angmar. This path was made to serve the forts along the walls, but long before, in the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Sul, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the days of the last alliance." The hobbits gazed at Strider. It seemed that he was learned in old lore, as well as in the ways of the wild. "Who is Gil-galad?" asked Mary, but Strider did not answer, and seemed to be lost in thought. Suddenly a low voice murmured, "Gil-galad was an elven king. Of him the harpers sadly sing, the last whose realm was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of the heavens' field were mirrored in his silver shield. But long ago he rode away, and where he dwelleth none can say. Far into darkness fell his star, in Mordor where the shadows are." The others turned in amazement, for the voice was Sam's. "Don't stop," said Mary. "That is all I know," stammered Sam, blushing. "I learned it from Mr. Bilbo when I was a lad. He used to tell me tales like that. Knowing how I was always one for hearing about elves, it was Mr. Bilbo who taught me my letters. He was mighty book-learned, as was dear old Mr. Bilbo, and he wrote poetry. He wrote that, as what I have just said." "He did not make it up," said Strider. "It is part of the lay that is called The Fall of Gil-galad, which is an ancient tongue. Bilbo must have translated it. I never knew that." "There was a lot more," said Sam. "All about Mordor. I didn't learn that part. It gave me the shivers. I never thought I should be going that way myself." "Going to Mordor?" cried Pippin. "I hope it won't come to that." "Do not speak that name so loudly," said Strider. It was already midday when they drew near the southern end of the path, and saw before them, in the pale clear light of the October sun, a gray-green bank leading up like a bridge on the northward slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once, while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the western flank of Weathertop they found a sheltered hollow, at the bottom of which there was a bowl-shaped dell with grassy sides. There they left Sam and Pippin with the pony and their packs and luggage. The other three went on. After half an hour's climb, Strider reached the crown of the hill. Frodo and Merry followed, tired and breathless. The last slope had been steep and rocky. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework, now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the center, a cairn of broken stones had been piled. They were blackened as if with fire. About them the turf was burned to the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if the flames had swept the hilltop, but there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all round below them, a wide prospect, for the most part of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodlands away to the south, beyond which They caught here and there the glint of distant water. Beneath them, on the southern side, there ran like a ribbon the old road, coming out of the west and winding up and down until it faded behind a ridge of dark land to the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward with their eyes, they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and somber. Behind them stood taller shapes of gray, and behind those again were high white peaks glimmering among the clouds. "Well, here they are," said Mary, "and very cheerless and uninviting it looks. There is no water and no shelter and no sign of Gandalf, but I don't blame him for not waiting if he ever came here." "I wonder," said Strider, looking round thoughtfully. "Even if he was a day or two behind us at Bree, he would have arrived here first. He can ride very swiftly when he presses." Suddenly he stopped and looked at the stone on the top of the cairn. It was flatter than the others and whiter, as if it had escaped the fire. He picked it up and examined it, turning it in his fingers. "This has been handled recently," he said. "What do you think of these marks?" On the flat underside, Frodo saw some scratches. "There seems to be a stroke, a dot, and 3 more strokes," he said. "The stroke on the left might be a G rune with thin branches," said Strider. "It might be a sign left by Gandalf, though one cannot be sure. The scratches are fine and they certainly look fresh, but the marks might mean something quite different and have nothing to do with us. Rangers use runes, and they come here sometimes." "What could they mean, even if Gandalf made them?" asked Mary. "I should say," answered Strider, "that they stood for G3 and were a sign that Gandalf was here on October the 3rd. That is 3 days ago now. It would also show that he was in a hurry and danger was at hand, so that he had no time or did not dare to write anything longer or plainer. If that is so, we must be wary." I wish we could feel sure that he made the marks, whatever they may mean," said Frodo. "It would be a great comfort to know that he was on the way, in front of us or behind us." "Perhaps," said Strider. "For myself, I believe he was here and was in danger. There have been scorching flames here, and now the light that we saw 3 nights ago in the eastern sky comes back to mind. I guess that he was attacked on this hilltop, but with what result I cannot tell. He is here no longer, and we must now look after ourselves and make our own way to Rivendell as best we can." "How far is Rivendell?" asked Mary, gazing round warily. The world looked wild and wide from Weathertop. "I don't know if the road has ever been measured in miles beyond the Forsaken Inn, a day's journey east of Bree," answered Strider. "Some day it is so far, and some say otherwise. It is a strange road, and folk are glad to reach their journey's end, whether the time is long or short. But I know how long it would take me on my own feet, with fair weather and no ill fortune. 12 days from here to the fort of Björnen, where the road crosses the Loudwater that runs out of Rivendell. We have at least a fortnight's journey before us, for I do not think we shall be able to use the road." "A fortnight?" said Frodo. "A lot may happen in that time." "It may," said Strider. They stood for a while silent on the hilltop, near its southward edge. In that lonely place, Frodo for the first time fully realized his homelessness and danger. He wished bitterly that his fortune had left him in the quiet and beloved Shire. He stared down at the hateful road leading back westward to his home. Suddenly he was aware that 2 black specks were moving slowly along it, going westward, and looking again, he saw that 3 others were creeping eastward to meet them. He gave a cry and clutched Strider's arm. "Look!" he said, pointing downwards. At once Strider flung himself to the ground behind the ruined circle, pulling Frodo down beside him. Merry threw himself alongside. "What is it?" he whispered. "I do not know, but I fear the worst," answered Strider. Slowly they crawled up to the edge of the ring again, and peered through a cleft between 2 jagged stones. The light was no longer bright, for the clear morning had faded, and clouds creeping out of the east had now overtaken the sun as it began to go down. They could all see the black specks, but neither Frodo nor Merry could make out their shapes for certain, yet something told them that there them that there, far below, were black riders assembling on the road beyond the foot of the hill. "Yes," said Strider, whose keener sight left him in no doubt. "The enemy is here." Hastily they crept away and slipped down the north side of the hill to find their companions. Sam and Peregrine had not been idle. They had explored the small dell and the surrounding slopes. Not far away they found a spring of clear water on the hillside, and near it footprints not more than a day or two old. In the dell itself they found recent traces of fire and other signs of hasty camp. There were some fallen rocks on the edge of the dell nearest the hill. Behind them, Sam came upon a small store of firewood neatly stacked. "I wonder if old Gandalf had been here," he said to Pippin. "Whoever it was, the stuff here meant to come back, it seems." Strider was greatly interested in those discoveries. "I wish I had waited and explored the ground down here myself," he said, hurrying off to the spring to examine the footprints. "It is just as I feared," he said when he came back. "Sam and Pippin have trampled the soft ground, and the marks are spoilt or confused. Rangers have been here lately. It is they who left the firewood behind. But there are also several newer tracks that were not made by Rangers. At least one set was made only a day or two ago by heavy boots. At least once. I cannot now be certain, but I think there were many booted feet." He paused and stood in anxious thought. Each of the hobbits saw in his mind a vision of the cloaked and booted riders, of the horsemen. If the horsemen had already found the dell, the sooner Strider led them somewhere else the better. Sam viewed the hollow with great dislike, now that he had heard news of their enemies on the road only a few miles away. "Hadn't we